Chapter 10 is dedicated entirely to Islam. This is a good chapter to give you a understanding of the Islamic religion and culture and politic. In order to understand Islam, you have to, of course, understand where Islam came from. And that means you have to understand who Muhammad was. Muhammad was much more than a religious figure. He was a catalyst for a revolution, in a sense, and a revolution in politics, economics, law, and civilization. From this one man's efforts arose dynasties, empires, legal traditions, liturgical rituals, art forms, and an enduring religion that now claims over 1 billion adherents. Moreover, the religion of Islam, taught by Muhammad in the 7th century, is currently the fastest growing religion in the world and the West, which is all very amazing given that the tradition says he was basically illiterate. And so he went on to accomplish some very amazing things, for sure. Muhammad was born in 570 in Mecca in the prominent but impoverished Banu Hashim clan of the Quraysh tribe. Muhammad lost his father before he was even born. His mother, by the time he was 5, died, and then he was subsequently raised by his paternal grandfather, a prominent member of the tribe, who also died a year later. If you fast forward many years into the future, in the year 610, this is where everything begins to get kind of interesting. Muhammad, after much prayer and fasting in the mountains near Mecca, he receives his very first revelations from Allah. Reportedly, he had many visions and dreams, and he even had heard voices. Then one day, the archangel Gabriel appears to him and commands him to recite, which Muhammad informs Gabriel that he can't read. And then Gabriel commences to put him in kind of a bear hug, kind of a wrestling move almost, commanding him to recite. And this happens on 3 separate occasions altogether. And so Muhammad goes to his wife, Khadijah, and he tells her, he's like trembling and shaking, and he tells her about this experience, and he wants her to cover him with a blanket. She's saying, he told her he thought he was losing his mind, and she's like, no, you're not losing your mind. So he falls asleep, and he has this dream, and then a vision again. Gabriel appears to him and begins to make him recite Quranic verses aloud again. So for the next 3 years, the prophet only shared his visions and verses with close friends and family. But by 613, he was publicly prophesying, and by 615, he had a huge following. His life career as a prophet can be divided into 2 major epochs, and that would be his Meccan period of his life, and then after they had gone and taken Midian, which would have been 622 to 632. Muhammad's primary message stressed the notion of a single God, the regard for morals above and beyond what tribal morals would say, kind of a absolute morality, and prayer. Muslim accounts record that Muhammad was uneducated, though there's actually a lot of debate amongst scholars who argue that in all likelihood he probably underwent some form of teaching, but tradition does say that he was uneducated and illiterate. But even the transmission of the Quran was in a kind of complete form in the mind of, either in the mind or maybe organized on paper during the life of Muhammad. So he may have done it himself. He may have had the whole Quran memorized. That would be a pretty amazing feat, but it's possible. The word Islam actually means submission to God. So the whole point of the religion is submission to Allah. Submission is what Islam means. Now, there are 5 pillars to Islam. And a famous passage out of a hadith sums up basically what these 5 pillars are. And the story goes that, and also in this hadith, it also outlines the 3 levels of faith in the practice of Islam, which is Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. But firstly, the story goes this way. Muhammad and his people are hanging out one day, and this man approaches them, and he's wearing wearing very white clothes, and he has very black hair. And he comes up to Muhammad, and he says, "Tell me, Muhammad, about Islam." And Muhammad replies, "Islam means you should testify that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, his prophet." And that is the first pillar of Islam, which is Shahada, which means bearing witness. Secondly, Muhammad tells him that you should observe the prayer, which is Salat. That's the second pillar of Islam. And then thirdly, he says you should pay the Zakat, which is charitable giving. Zakat actually means purification, and so tithing or giving charitably, giving alms is kind of purification, and that's one of the pillars of Islam. The fourth pillar is, he tells this gentleman that you should fast during Ramadan. And so Ramadan fast is called Sawm or Siyam, which is when the Muslim, during a certain time of the year, does not eat during the daytime. And this is done worldwide throughout the Islamic community. And the fifth pillar of Islam is to make a pilgrimage to the Kaaba if you have the means to go, which the Kaaba is the giant black cube that's in the center of the mosque, as you can see in your text there in Mecca. And that is the Hajj. It's called the Hajj, which is to make your pilgrimage to Mecca. And that is the fifth pillar of Islam. And then the man says, "You've spoken the truth." And then he asks the Prophet, "Tell me about belief, Iman." And Muhammad replies, "Iman means that you should believe in Allah, His angels, His books, His messengers, and the last day, and that you should believe in the decree of both good and evil." Then the man said, "Now tell me about perfection, which is Ihsan." Muhammad replies, "It means that you should worship Allah as though you saw Him, for He sees you, though you do not see Him." The way the story goes is the guy walks away, and then they find out that it was actually Gabriel who had presented himself, kind of hidden himself in order to come and ask these questions of Muhammad to see how he answers. And that's the story in the Hadith. But that gives you a good idea, especially of what Islam is broken down, the 5 pillars, and then Iman and Ihsan. The Quran is, of course, the central text of Islam. And this text in its entirety was given by divine revelation to the Prophet Muhammad. Of course, the transmission and the carrying over through the generations of the Quran, this responsibility fell on that of the caliphs. The caliph's act is basically, the word just means acts on behalf of another. Now, the first 4 caliphs were instrumental in defining the nature of Islam and ensuring its long-term survival. And they're known to Muslims as the 4 rightly guided caliphs. One of the early tasks of the caliphs was to ensure that the Quran was written in an authentic and unalterable form so that the words of the Prophet would not be corrupted through the years. A single version of the Quran was adopted and all others destroyed. Even today, there are not different versions of the Quran. Translations into modern languages are all considered interpretations of the Quran rather than the Quran itself. Devout Muslims who no longer speak this form of Arabic, even in Arabia, learn the language of the Quran and commit much of the book to memory. Arabic, like Hebrew in Judaism, is one of the things that binds the worldwide Islamic community, the Huma, together. And I mentioned a little bit about the caliphs, and they were the leaders. And part of the early tension in Islam came in how these leaders were selected, and it was strongly debated between the two primary groups whether it should be someone who was related to Muhammad directly or someone who was elected as in the best, fit for the job. And this created two groups, the Sunni and the Shiite, which is very interesting because a lot of the conflict that goes on in the world, but within the world of Islam, is typically between the Sunni and the Shiite, namely what's taking place in Iraq. And a lot of people don't know the difference between the two groups, which is really fascinating. In 2006, in a series of interviews, this guy, Jeff Stein, who was the national security editor at the Congressional Quarterly in Washington, concluded that most, not some, but most of the counterterrorism and members of Congress that were responsible for making decisions about our activities in the Middle East did not even know the difference between Sunni and Shiite. So it's important. So you're going to do one better, and you're going to actually know the difference. So Sunni Islam is the mainstream Islam of the vast majority of the Muslim community. By 2007, there were at least 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, of whom almost 90% were Sunni Muslims. The only serious dissenters from Sunni Islam are the adherents of the Shia, which literally means faction. So the majority is Sunni, the minority is Shia, the Shiite, and they're the faction, the breakaway group. Though Shiites, it must be stressed, share all the basic tenets of Islam with the Sunni faith. The original difference, as I mentioned a second ago, that the Shia and the Sunni was a political thing. In the 7th century, the Shia were those who wanted Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, to succeed him as leader of the community. The Sunni majority took a different view, that the consensus of the community should prevail on the issue of who would be the best leader. Over the years, the difference became doctrinal and cultural. Sunni Muslims are so called because of the Sunnah, the way of the Prophet as reported in the Hadith, which together with the Quran is the basis of all Muslim faith. The Prophet Muhammad is the messenger of Islam, as it was to him that the book was revealed. An important way in which the Sunni Islam differs from the Shiite faith is its lack of hierarchy. As has often been said, there is no pope in Islam. Those who are regarded as learned and authoritative are so seen because of the respect of their peers and not because of their occupancy of any particular position. Although united in their common confession of faith in God, the Quran, and the Prophet Muhammad, the histories of the Sunni and the Shiite produce different notions of leadership. In Sunni Islam, the Caliph serves as the selected or elected successor of Muhammad. He functions as the political and military leader of the community, but not as their prophet. In Shia Islam, the Imam, leader, selected from among the members of a community, must be a direct descendant of the prophet's family. In Shia, the Imam is not only the political, but also the religious leader of the community. Though not a prophet, he is considered the divinely inspired, sinless, infallible, final authoritative interpreter of God's will as formulated in Islamic law. So as Islam grew through the centuries, they actually contributed quite a bit intellectually. While we did have an increasing element of scholarship and intellectual movement in the West with Greece and Rome, the Byzantine Empire, all that in Europe, there was and of course over in China, we talked about that some, the input that they had intellectually. There was this kind of insulated thing going on at the same time, rising up through the centuries in the Islamic world. Arab scholars actually preserved hundreds of ancient Greek manuscripts by collecting them and writing down, copying the information into Arabic. And so the works of Plato, Aristotle, Archimedes, Hippocrates, Galen, Ptolemy, and others were all texts that were taken by the Arabs and copied. Now, this period of the translation period that we're referring to here is called the Abbasid translation period, which Abbasid was the name of those that ruled Baghdad, which was the capital of Arabia, from the 8th to the 10th centuries. The philosophical library available to Arabic scholars showed a conspicuous presence of the witness of Neoplatonic thought. In addition to having the collected writings of Plato and Aristotle, these scholars rather quickly gained access in Arabic translations to other important works of metaphysics, such as the Aeneids of Plotinus and the Elements of Theology by Proclus, and then to the treatises and commentaries of many other exponents of the later Platonic and Aristotelian period. Another interesting fact, although not Islamic but Arabic, scholars in this period of time, during the same sort of insulated movement in the Abbasid translation period, were copying and preserving translations of the Bible into Arabic. And there's actually a leading scholarly work on this topic, if it all interests you, and it's by a guy, Sidney Harrison Griffith. I hope it's a guy, could be a girl, it's Sidney, but it's called The Bible in Arabic, and it's the scriptures of the people of the book in the language of Islam, and this was Princeton, came out this year in 2013. Also, going on at the same period of time, we have the contribution that Islam was making in a literary sense, and among that would be, of course, poetry and prose. The Andalusian Sufi author, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, I can't say that, of course, we'll just call him Muhyiddin, has had a huge impact on Islamic thought. He is best remembered for his dense Benzels of Wisdom, which builds on a Quranic core to discuss the significance of each of a range of prophets and has been the subject of some 150 commentaries. His other major work is the vast and partly autobiographical Meccan Illuminations, which contains over 9,000 folios in the autographed manuscript. The Sufis, who were kind of what they call the mystics of Islam, they've been called and defined as mystics, but they comprise a set of techniques by which Muslims have sought a direct personal encounter with the divine. While it is true that Sufism encompasses many mystical elements, the broad social reach that it acquired over the centuries of expansion rendered it much more than the path of an esoteric elite. In fact, their literary contribution is quite vast, and your text does talk about that as well. Prose is not poetry, of course. I think you probably know that, hopefully, by this point in college. But poetry is the rhyme. Prose could be stories. And the rich diversity of Islamic culture is nowhere better revealed, however, than in the collection of prose tales known as the 1001 Nights. This literary classic, gradually assembled between the 8th and 10th centuries, brought together in the Arabic tongue various tales from Persian, Arabic, and Indian sources. And the story goes, a king marries a wife, he's jealous, crazy, so he kills her. Marries a new wife, he's jealous, kind of nuts, kills her. He's going through this cycle until one day he marries this woman, and she begins to tell him a story, and by the end of that night, whereas he would usually kill his wife, the story was so good that had to wait till the next day. He would let her live so he could hear the rest of the story, and that goes on for 1001 nights. Finally, at the very end of the string of tales, he decides he should repent and say he is sorry, and they live happily ever after. As one source says, the original collection has no one author and no single source. The stories are Indian, Persian, and Arabic, and were told in many forms for many centuries before they were actually written down. A little bit on architecture, art, and music, and we'll draw this to a close. Islamic architecture has, in common with medieval Christian architecture of the great cathedrals, an understanding of the power, significance, and beauty of geometry that transcends its purely mathematical nature. The most important building in Mecca is the Holy Mosque of Mecca, which contains the Kaaba, which is a tall box-like structure which stands in a courtyard in the center of the mosque. And the Kaaba is pre-Islamic in origin, although at the beginning of the Islamic period it became established as the main object of pilgrimages to Mecca. And I believe I read somewhere that it says, that inside that Kaaba was at one time all of these, pagan idols and shrines and things that were not, Islamic from the pre-Islamic period. And then it's kind of a reclaiming of space for Islam, and that's why they go and honor the one single God by going around the square, the cube, the black cube called the Kaaba, during their Hajj to Mecca. Also, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, Spain, is an epic example of Islamic architecture. You can also see a picture and kind of some diagrams of that in your text. And then, of course, there's also the highly coveted Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is a beautiful Muslim shrine in the walled old city of Jerusalem. It consists of two sections that are imbricated into each other. Now, the first is a tall cylinder set over a large natural rocky outcrop, topped nowadays by a gilded dome made of aluminum alloy. The second is an octagonal ring of two ambulatories on piers and columns around the central rock. The final word on music, and we'll close. For the devout Muslim, there was no religious music other than the sound of the chanted Quran and the muezzin's call to prayer. It's a hard word to say. Muezzin's call to prayer. And if you're anywhere in the Islamic world, at the time of the call to prayer, the speakers begin to play. It's kind of poetic. And if you have, of course, you have the digital book. Maybe you have McGraw-Hill, and I know on the ebook version you can listen to some of those samples of music from the call to prayer, which is pretty interesting. Muslims regarded music as a kind of forbidden pleasure, so to speak, and condemned it as a killing charm, which is from the 1001 Nights description. Nevertheless, the therapeutic uses of music were recognized by Arab physicians, and its sensual powers were celebrated by Sufi mystics. During Islam's golden age, secular music flourished in the courts of Cordoba and Baghdad, and even earlier, Arab song mingled with the music of Persia, Syria, Egypt, and the Byzantium. Now, voice typically dominated over instruments. The melodic line of Arab song weaves and wanders, looping and repeating themes in a kind of oral arabesque. The voice slides and intones in subtle and hypnotic stretches. And there was kind of a dominance of voice over instruments, but there was a small, tradition of instruments in Persia with the lute and other instruments similar to that kind of predated the guitar. But to give you an idea of this Arab song, the way it weaves and wanders and loops is very similar to that from Buddhist monks, the way they would chant, and some of the way Christians would chant, the Gregorian chants. And so as we close out this lecture, I will leave you with a selection of actually the Psalms read or sang, so to speak, in Arabic. It's got an interesting sound to it, but I thought it would be a great way for you to experience this kind of arabesque sound, sliding intonation, subtle hypnotic stretches. And we'll close with that, and that is the chapter on Islam brought to a conclusion.
وخطيئتي أمام